I'm Jay Horton. I make movies that make money. This is how. Today I'm going to give you my top 10 mistakes that new filmmakers make. Number 1, not understanding the audience. Who is it you're making this movie for? And how are you going to reach them? If you can't answer those questions, you probably shouldn't be making your movie. I know. What about just expressing yourself creatively and letting the movie find its audience? Aren't we doing this for the love of the game, for the art? Well, if you're independently wealthy or can do a movie for no money and don't mind the time loss, then go for it. But if you want to go from being a hobbyist filmmaker to a professional, you gotta put work into the business side that's equal to or even greater than the movie itself. Sure, there are still filmmakers that do make movies for just themselves and they hit big, but they're outliers. They are lottery ticket winners. For every Ari Aster or Safdie brothers, there are at least 1,000 other failed film directors whose movies are every bit as worthy of the masses' attention, but they don't get it. So when you get an idea for a movie, by all means, dive in. But take just a minute to ask yourself, who is the audience for this movie? How will I reach them? What's my distribution plan? And as you write and further develop the movie, keep these things in mind at every stage, especially the audience one. Now, all that said, there is another way. The one for me, the one for them method. Or in my case, 10 for them and 1 for me method. I make both documentaries and narrative features. When I do documentaries, I almost always take the audience first approach. And I make the bulk of my income right now on those. Then, once a year or so, using my own money now, I put together a new narrative feature. And when I do those movies, I make whatever the f I want. Pure personal expression. And yeah, I still try my best to consider the audience and how I'll reach them, but if I fail and that narrative feature doesn't find its audience, I got 10 other projects to cover those losses. Well, that's all well and good, but most new filmmakers aren't going to have that number of projects. You got one. And you have to make money on that one to do another, and so on. If you want to continue to make movies, start thinking about your audience and marketing at the get. Number 2, taking on too much responsibility and not delegating. Sometimes, depending on your budget, it's absolutely necessary to be the director, writer, editor, DP, caterer, location manager, everything. I totally started out like that. And to be honest, to this day, I still take on a lot of those roles when I do my documentaries. It's how I keep my budget so low and my profits so high. But some of the biggest mistakes on some of the narrative features I've done in the past were not delegating tasks where I should have. Just because you can do something doesn't necessarily mean you should. Number 3, not understanding the importance of good sound versus visuals. I know, hot take for the DPs and the camera folk out there, but most general audiences are much more forgiving of minor camera flaws than they are of sound flaws. Nothing signifies an amateur shoot faster than bad sound. Think about it. If the sound mix is excellent, you can shoot a movie on mini DV, blow it up to 35mm, put it in a theater, and mainstream audiences will accept it as artistic intent. Conversely though, shoot that exact same movie on 70mm, gorgeous cinematography, and record the audio on a tape recorder. No one will sit through it. I'm certainly not suggesting ignoring or not striving for the best visuals you can get, but what I am saying is that you should put that same kind of effort into your sound. I've been on hundreds of sets, and the one tech department whose importance is constantly overlooked is sound. Number 4, not shooting enough BTS, behind the scenes. This kind of goes with the marketing, but in today's day and age with high-end cameras on pretty much all of our phones, there's no excuses not to get tons and tons of behind the scenes interviews and footage. And at the end of the day, all this material can be repurposed into a feature-length documentary, which might actually do better than the movie. Then you can use it for promo clips, stuff to build your social media. I repurpose my behind the scenes for this YouTube channel. Number 5, worrying too much about which particular camera to use. Man, I'm gonna get DPs all over my ass on these, but this one triggers me. I often see very visually adept filmmakers that will actually not shoot their movie because they only have access to a Red and they want an ARRI. I totally understand that different cameras are better for different jobs, and I'm not dismissing that. But at the end of the day, it's the story that matters most. Number 6, not covering your butt legally. Each movie should have its own LLC. Now, if you're making a lot of really low budget movies, this isn't always feasible. In that case, I recommend to put the movies into groups. For example, I have several documentaries that cover similar topics, and I sometimes group those together into a single LLC. But I do this knowing full well that it's a risk. When you do a separate LLC, that movie is completely legally separate from your other work. If somebody comes after it for whatever reason and wins, the damage is limited to that movie. However, if you have those movies grouped together into a single LLC, it can hurt them all. Then there's contracts. You should have contracts not just for your talent, but for all of the crew. Most importantly is probably producer agreements. That's because the job responsibilities and back end for producers are so fluid and change from project to project. You have to be clear from the get-go what is expected of a particular producer and what their back end is. It can be really easy on ULB films to think that you can just ignore this. I mean, who's really monitoring these kind of movies anyway? You might be working with predominantly friends or family on your crew. You don't need contracts for them, right? Well, with that, I'll say this. I've been sued exactly 2 times as a filmmaker, and both times was either by a friend or someone I trusted implicitly. I probably could have avoided it had I had better contracts in place. Remember, even if they don't win, people can sue you for anything. Having a solid contract in place can help you avoid this kind of nuisance. And if it does turn into something more major, it's the best way to cover yourself. Number 7, when someone else is funding you, taking more money than what the market is going to support for that movie. This kind of harkens back to the I'm just making movies for the art thing. That's all well and good. But if you're doing that with someone else's money and don't plan for what the current market is going to support, that's just irresponsible. Unless the financier is just putting in the money to support you as an artist and has no real expectations of making it back, the filmmaker has a moral obligation to do everything in their power to make that money back. Now that said, even well-executed and properly marketed movies do fail. Film investing is a risk, and sometimes we just lose. As long as the investor is aware of the risk, the filmmaker is in the clear as far as I'm concerned. Number 8, giving away too much ownership to get a movie done. Especially early on in our careers, a lot of us are willing to do or give up almost anything to get the movie made. 99% to the investor? No problem. I just want to make my movie. And sometimes it takes something like this to get your first movie or 2 done. I've done those kind of movies. But at a certain point, if you want to turn making truly independent movies into a career, you have to start thinking about your back end and ownership. I personally don't direct or produce movies anymore that I don't have a sizable stake in. I look back at all these works for hire I did as an indie film director a few years back, and the money I made on them is long gone. And I did everything on some of these. Well, almost. From writing to directing to editing to crewing up. And I own exactly 0% of them. Number 9, not working hard enough on the script. I'll be quick here. A bad script won't be saved by great shots, score, and editing. The script is the blueprint for success. If the script isn't there, the movie isn't there. And the number 10 mistake that a lot of new filmmakers make, putting all their eggs in one basket, going all in on one single movie, thinking that will be their launching pad to success. I'm gonna hit you with some tough love here. The thinking that that first movie is gonna break you out, it most likely won't. Especially in this day and age, indie filmmaking has become a numbers game. If you make 10 movies, 6 or 7 are gonna fail. If you're lucky, 3 or 4 of those will hit or at least make enough profit to cover the losses. And that's if you're lucky. Now, you might not be in a position where you can finance a slate of films. Most of us aren't. But what you can do is start planning that slate out before the first film is even shot. And understand that the whole paradigm of doing one indie movie a year is most likely not going to yield the results you need to make a living off of just the movies. If you're a filmmaker that absolutely needs that year to finish your ULB film, you better have some other avenues to make ends meet. And don't get me wrong, there's nothing wrong with that approach. If you want to spend a year and make your movie and then make ends meet in the meantime doing, freelance editing or shooting, that's all great. And it can yield some pretty cool movies. But for me, I don't like working for people. And I can't afford to make one movie a year. I love making movies. And for me to continue to do so, I need to make them as fast as possible and for as little as possible. Then, like I said before, once a year or so, I make one movie that takes a little longer, costs a little more, but I have all the little ones to cover it if it loses. Filmmaker tips for filmmakers. I crept into a couple of Facebook filmmaking groups and asked some other filmmakers, what are the biggest mistakes that you see new filmmakers make? Here's what they said. Not understanding the real importance of score. Even people who study here at USC are often taught about film music by the very first composer they work with. The ones who understand how crucial an aspect the score is and what it does to bring the screen to life are often the ones who stand out the most. Can't argue that. Not getting enough good critical feedback throughout the process, whether at the script level, in post-production, or after the project is finished, so that they can learn and grow. Sure. Don't ever make films using your own money, unless you got a lot extra. I put this one in here because it's a pretty popular phrase in film. I personally think this is old thinking and is most often better applied to bigger $1,000,000+ budgets. In actuality, I think putting the money in yourself is the very best way to do an indie film, if you have the means. Then you have no one to answer to. And if it does fail, you're not hurting anyone else. Take note that I said, if you have the means. And I'm certainly not suggesting putting yourself in debt or in a position where you can't pay your bills. Filmmaking is a very risky endeavor. Only put into it what you can afford to lose. But financially speaking, the most important aspect of indie film is ownership. Keep the biggest piece of the pie that you can, and the best way to do that is to own the movie straight up. If you're liking my stuff, please subscribe. And if you'd like a marketing or distribution consultation on your next feature film, check out my Patreon. But whatever you do, keep making movies. Oh, and share this